and welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 66. Tonight we're going to be talking about the notion of texture. So let me just show you what I'm talking about. Just that notion of texture in photography. How do we make sure things look like they feel? Can you look at an image and get a sense of what touch would be like with it? So that's going to be the main thing, and that's all leading up towards the fact that next week we're going to be having a texture challenge for you to see what you can do with your cameras to create photos which have lots of texture in them and make us think of the texture that's being used. Stick around for the end. At the end of this show, I'll just talk a little bit more about the texture challenge at the end. Second part of the tonight's episode is also a critique, where we've had three different people put in for feedback on our images this week. Inga, actually, keeping with that notion of texture, says that there's particular kind of themes that run through a lot of her photos. She's got this sort of picture of a hammock where, though you can see there is some texture in the red, she's wondering if there's ways of improving that in post-production. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Sandra had this lovely shot of the setting sun cutting through the lobster baskets, but she feared the part of the problem was that she lost detail in the sky and she lost detail in the shadows, and she's wondering if there's what she could have done about that or what she could do with that in post-processing. So we're going to chat about that as well. And then finally, VG put in a photo or two where she was wondering about the cropping. So we're going to talk about that in turn. So that's all to come up. Here we are live on Facebook. If you're here, leave a comment. Let me know where you're from, and we can get the chat going. I will periodically stop, look in, read comments, see what's going on. Feel free to leave comments, ask questions as things occur to you. Alternatively, if you're not watching live but are watching this on YouTube, I record all these episodes and stick them on YouTube. So if you go to youtube.com/Kim Ayres, you will find the previous 65 episodes. So lots to dive into. You will also find behind the scenes videos of photo shoots I've done, and some bite-sized things as well that where I've taken sections from these podcasts, which make them a little bit more easily consumable. So lots to find there. So if you do go to YouTube, make sure, or you are watching this on YouTube now, make sure you subscribe and click the little notifications bell so that you know when new stuff appears. The only other thing to mention at this point is if you find these podcasts useful or interesting or entertaining and you would like to support them in any way, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is the place to do it. It's not absolutely compulsory, but it is always appreciated. Right, with that in mind, let's take a look. I can see there's comments coming in already, which is great. It's always nice to know that I'm not sitting here on my own. Jim Harkness from Dumfries says, "Hi everybody, hope you're well." Maggie, my wife, is saying hi. Ben saying hello, all from a very damp Edinburgh. Stacey says, "Good afternoon from a warm and sunny afternoon in Hatboro, Pennsylvania. I hope everyone is enjoying their day." Pat says, "Hi all from deepest Somerset." Andy says, "Good evening, everyone." Jackie says, "Hello from a freezing cold South Africa." Well, of course, yes, we're midsummer here in the UK, but of course, I suppose that's midwinter down in the southern hemisphere. Brian says, "Hi Kim and all who are watching." Russ says, "Evening everyone from a grey, chilly South Gloucestershire." Sandra says, "Everyone from a rainy Birmingham." Well, we certainly seem to have the full range of weather. Morven says, "Hello from Dumfries." April says, "Hello from a hot, sunny New York." Oh wow, you're over in New York. That's a great thing to do. Place to go. Inga says, "Good evening from a quite warm Oslo." And Roy says, "Hello all from West Yorkshire." This is great. So we got a good crew in tonight. Right. Okay, excellent. Excuse me. So, texture. This is what we want to talk about. There's a whole notion. First of all, it's worth talking about what I think. Oh, sorry. Fiji's just popped in from India as well. It says hello, everyone. So I want to talk about the notion of texture. But first of all, to put that in some kind of context, there's a certain idea of what photography is. And I think, or certainly what you're trying to achieve, what most of us are trying to achieve with photography, which is what separates out interesting photography from just a quick snapshot, is the idea of depth, of story, of narrative, of the feeling that there's something more to the image than what you just immediately visually see. And a quick snapshot is just telling you everything you need to know in an instant. Here's a quick picture of my lunch. Here's a quick picture of my coffee. Here's a quick selfie. It's not necessarily telling you anything more. Now, you can do a lot more with a selfie, as we've explored in previous episodes. But very often these things are just done as very quick, instant things. But interesting photography, I think the photos that tend to grab our attention tend to be ones where what we are doing is it feels like there's more to it than just something instant. And the way to do that is when we're creating the photo, we have to evoke ideas, thoughts, memories, projections in the viewer. It's a really important thing. Sometimes we do that through the notion of time, as in you get somebody looking and saying, oh, I wonder what happened just before that photo was taken, or what happened just after. If you take a moment and it's frozen, there's that sense of a movement in time, and the viewer has to project themselves or imagine what was happening just before or after. Sometimes it's to do with space. You're wondering what's just outside the edge of the photos, or just the other side of the camera, what's in front, what was the photographer also seeing that isn't contained within the image. And sometimes it's about evoking the other senses. It's about trying, can you make a photograph almost smell or taste? Or can you hear the sound? You know, if you see a picture of a waterfall, can you hear the roar or the trickle? These are the kind of photos which I think tend to be really interesting. And a key part of this is the notion of texture. Texture is not just pattern and shape, but it evokes the sense of touch. We have that sense of what would it feel like on the tips of our fingers, or rubbed against the side of our face, or brushed against with our arm, or sat on. So that notion then of texture in photography is a really important one. So let me show you sort of just how textures change, and to sort of let's throw up some examples of some textures. Okay, I mean, what I'll do, I'll run through here. These are unedited photos, but just ones I took of tulips in the garden during the summer. So if I flip across here, so just to sort of get a sense first of all, that notion then of texture. What do you feel when you get a sense? Now, if you've never come across a tulip before, perhaps you're not entirely sure, because one part of evoking texture is familiarity. If you see the fur of a cat, then you know kind of what the fur, unless you've never been near a cat before, you're going to know what that fur feels like. So there is a certain extent of familiarity. But what we're also trying to do here, within this one as well, there's little water droplets, so we know what water feels like. So it's slightly damp, but it's not completely. There's a sort of, where it's here, there's a sort of kind of texture here, but there's a different texture on the sort of flower part. So it kind of feels like, I don't know, the outer leaves here are likely to be firmer and thicker, and the red part, the petals that are kind of coming out, are likely to be softer. But part of that comes through that notion of familiarity. If we take through the sequence then, and we come into when the tulip has now, the outer kind of shielding protection has now become just the petals, or has fallen away. Now we can see this, and what we can see here is that there's a silkiness to it. Because another part then of that notion of texture is the way it's reflecting light, the reflection of the light, kind of gives a little way. Is it very glossy? Is it silky? Is it matte? That's all kind of interfering. And again, because we kind of know maybe what flowers are like, we can kind of imagine the silkiness, smoothness of these petals. But of course, then you can go on to the bit whereby it's past its best. It's now in the throes of decay. And at this point, it's now starting to look dried out. It's shriveled. It's not that sort of bright, fresh smoothness. Now we've got this, it's becoming drier. It is becoming more brittle for sure. That shininess, that shiny freshness that was there in the thing is started to disappear. It's becoming much more matte, and in the older parts it's becoming even more so. The shininess has disappeared. Then if we move on to where it's shriveled even more, now it's become that shininess is definitely disappearing. It's really starting to look much drier, much more brittle. That if you ran your thumb across it, that there would be a harderness to the texture, that it goes in and out as well. And then finally you get to sort of this bit where the tulip has just sort of, all the colour has gone. It's faded back. It was the skeleton of what it used to be. And again, we've got all the ridges here, and the ridges we can tell because of the light and shadow. So which is the third element of texture, which is the way light and shadow combine to give us a sense of depth. So with familiarity, reflection of light, and depth of shadow, these are the things which all start to evoke the notion of texture. So, I see we've got a couple more here of hellos. Nuria says hello everyone. Becca says hello, hi everyone, every evening. And Robert's saying howdy all from Texas. And Kazia is saying good evening everyone. So we've got a good crowd in tonight then. Okay, so having given you that kind of introduction through the stages of a tulip, let me show you some other things and see if you can see what kind of sense you get from these. So again, okay, let's show you a few different textures here. Here we have grasses, these sort of grasses in the garden. We started off with no mow May, where we weren't mowing a whole chunk of the garden because it makes it better for the insects and pollinators, and it's now come into a kind of pretty much no mow summer, I think. I've been carving pathways through the lawn, but we've been leaving a lot of it unmowed, and actually we've been getting these really beautiful tall grasses which I really quite like. But you can get a sense of texture. You can kind of imagine what it would be like if you were to run your fingers through it. And sometimes there's the notion almost you're evoking smell as well. Do you know what the grasses smell like? Or the freshly mown lawn is one in particular. Other textures then. So this is a peony, and this is these aren't edited, by the way. Or this one isn't at any rate. Just taken the other evening, and the softness, the silkiness, the real smoothness, that there's not a lot of contrast between the light and the dark, and you can again that probably much softer than the tulip. Whilst tulip petal had a sort of sheen to it, but a certain thickness to it, this feels lighter as well. I mean, maybe it's difficult for me to know how much. I mean, we've actually got some peonies which we've cut from the garden and put into a jar of water on our kitchen table. The smell is lovely, and the softness, if you just kind of lightly brush it against your face, you can really kind of feel it. Another one, if you happen to know sweet peas. Sweet peas have the most gorgeous scent as well, but very small. I mean, that flower is probably only about this big. About that big. And it's very small, very delicate. And although it's got this patterning in it, you can see, all this kind of patterning. That patterning doesn't really have a lot in the way of texture. Not texture that you can pick out with your fingertips at any rate. So it feels quite soft and smooth, has a beautiful scent. But of course, unless you've ever smelt sweet peas, that's not necessarily going to evoke that smell because you won't have the memory of it. So these are very kind of soft textures. You can have harder textures, things like pebbles. You go down to the beach, or you find it, and these are very hard. But you can also see there's little bits here where there's a dampness in them as well. That these aren't dry, completely dry pebbles. There are pebbles, like here, and we can tell because of the layer of reflection. To go back to that notion then of reflected light. So we've got a mix of, remember, texture is being evoked by familiarity of subject to the viewer, by the quality of light reflecting on the surface, and the depth of shadow that's being placed there as well. So the amount of shadow gives us a sense of how deep that these pebbles are, maybe, a layer without, we don't know we don't know how deep the pebbles are, but we know that it's relatively flat. That probably the biggest one probably isn't much deeper than about that. Whereas if we take something like this, then we can go on to the sort of metallic side of, and we can tell that we recognise a coin, so it's familiarity. There is that shininess that you get from metal, and that shininess is maybe slightly different if you end up with wet metal. So on this sundial then, so it's metal, we can tell, but also the reflection on it, the reflectiveness of the surface also makes us realise that it's wet. It's wet metal. This is a sundial taken when there was no sun out, when it was just raining, as opposed to this metal, which is the image I've been using to promote this tonight's podcast, which is completely and utterly rusty. With this, what we've got is a large bolt, which has been, it's actually in the side of a piece of wood down by the waters by the sea, and it's been rusted by the salt air and the salt water. But we can get that sense of texture. You can sort of see the ridges, and the ridges are sort of coming out of the shadows that are taking place. Now, interestingly, with this, we also tend to have a sense with shadows of helping us to tell which way round something is, because by and large, 99.9% of stuff we see, our light source tends to be above us. Certainly, so daytime light, daylight, the sun is overhead. Now, even if it's pretty near the horizon, it's still slightly above. And so most of the time, we expect the shadows to be underneath. And what I want to do here is just show you briefly what happens if I rotate this image. So if I rotate this 90 degrees, we kind of feel like it's on its side now. The image has been turned, or that there is a very strong side light coming from the right. If I rotate that 180 degrees, so we're over here, again we get the feeling that it's either sitting on its side or there is now a really strong light coming from the left. But if I rotate this now here, it definitely feels like it's upside down. It's unlikely that all the light source would be coming from below. It's not impossible. This could be kind of under some eaves or something, under a sort of shade, and so that there's actually more light being reflected from underneath, but it's far less common. And so when we're looking for texture, very often that notion of where the light is coming from is also influencing how we're going to see that. Other forms of texture, a couple more quickly and then I want to show you something else. So here we can see that notion of it's sort of willow, it's wood. Again, we can kind of recognise the thickness of the texture, and what I've done here is by having a light source that is fairly low to the side, that's emphasising the texture. Now I'm going to come on to a little bit more in that in a minute, but let's just show you a couple more textures and then we'll move on to the next stage here. So here we've got pine cones, and we notice pointy bits, and we know from experience hard pointy bits here. These don't look soft. They feel like they were probably, jab our finger or could scratch us if we kind of gripped it a bit too hard. They've also, though, on this one in particular, we notice it's wet because of the reflective the way the light is reflecting on it. More so than this one. This one's maybe slightly damp over on the left, but this one on the right is definitely much, much wetter. So if you think about the fact that you can tell the difference between the one on the left and the one on the right, the amount of dampness just by looking at it, that's reinforcing that notion of the reflectiveness of the surface is giving you that sense of texture as well. Close up of a cone here. This is a slightly different one. This one isn't damp, but now we've got lichens and what have you on it, and so we've got extra texture within the cone, on the texture of the cone. This is obviously using a macro lens, zooming in. Or we could have, again, multiple textures. You take this sort of wooden footpath sign, and we've got the texture of the dried out wood, but we've also got the texture of what looks like very dry, hard lichens on the wood itself. And then there's textures of nails and staples and what have you, where it looks like over the years loads and loads of notices will have been just pinned to this footpath, probably for particular walks that people have been doing out in the country, and directions and what have you. And then finally, if we take a look at things like food, again, familiarity will help you know that this cheese is fairly freshly melted. It's not started to dry out yet. There's that oiliness of a kind of a freshly baked pizza, where you've even got sort of some of the sort of strings of the cheese sort of holding onto the side as this is being cut. And certainly I can look at that and I can smell it. But maybe, again, if you're unfamiliar with pizza, if it's a food you've never come across, then maybe you wouldn't be quite so sure what it is you're looking at. But chances are, even if you hadn't come across pizza before, you still know what melted cheese and grilled vegetables are like. So that's to kind of give you a sense of generalized texture. But what I really want to, let me just take a sort of close a few. I've now got hundreds of windows open. All right, let's take a couple of look at some comments, and then I want to show you something where how much difference the angle of the light is going to make. So a few comments here. Sandra loves the grasses picture. What aperture did I use? Oh, the aperture on the grasses picture was f4.5. And I was using my 100mm macro lens with that. So because it's a macro lens and it's already at that 4.5 gives a kind of wider aperture or narrower depth of field rather than say a 50mm lens would. Becca says she can smell that sweet pea. Stacey says I would get weeds if I didn't mow. If I had wild flowers, I wouldn't mow either. Very nice. Oh, Michelle's joined us with hello everyone. April likes the coin photo. Stacey loves the sundial. Sandra likes the pebbles. Ben likes the rusty nail, and you can imagine flaking the surface off. Yeah, that's something else as well. Again, a kind of familiarity of just sort of picking the layers off something which is falling apart. April says, Kim, and to anyone out there, do you feel that more clarity versus less clarity has a big impact on the texture of the photograph? Let's say a flower, for example. Yes, it does. And I will come on to that in a moment. I'm not going to show a flower. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show a stone carving and how I change the light. So bear with me on that one, please, April, and I'll come back to you. Stacey says, rust makes great texture. Jackie says the pine cones are good. Jackie also likes the idea of having more than one texture in a single image, and VG says yes, you buy pizza in India too. So cool. Right. Okay. So what I want to show you now then is that notion of how much light is making difference to the depth of the texture. And for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a picture of a stone carving. Now, these photos are unedited, but I just did them yesterday when I suddenly thought this would be quite a good idea. Now, this is a large chunk of sandstone, roughly about about 2 foot high, fairly thick, very heavy. And many, many years ago, I went through a stone carving phase. We're talking 25-ish, maybe between 25 to 30 years ago. I used to play around with stone carving, and on this stone I carved. It's a Celtic design, and there's, or Celtic Pictish kind of thing. There's you've got two horses that come down, and then almost like seahorses, your tails kind of swirl around. Now, the thing is with this is that what I've got here is this is sitting in the shadow. So the only light on this stone is reflected light. You're not getting any angled light on it. It's just the ambient light. And what we find is we can barely see anything. Okay, now I can zoom in. There's a texture of the sand. We can make out certain textures because of difference in colour. We can kind of vaguely see little bits of shadow where there's bits of carving, but it's not that clear what the carving is. Now, next what I did was I laid it down flat. The sun is coming from, but actually really it was sort of taken that way. The sun was coming from the top left. So it's creating a bit of shadow here, but and we can see sort of some deeper lines. But mostly because the sun is quite high at this point, and it's sort of coming mostly sort of directly from above. Again, we're not getting huge amount in terms of detail. There's not enough contrast going on. Now, if we turn this, so then I turn this and I'm facing the sun, but I pulled it upright. So now the sun is above, it's behind me, so it's facing onto the thing, and it's slightly higher. So now what we're seeing is the shadow coming underneath certain bits. So where there's a ridge above, we can see the depth of it there. But round here where it's not so, so there are parts there where it's clearer, parts where it's not. This then is turned almost exactly 90 degrees to the sun. If you look at the shadow below, you can see that, it's running. And the sun is just literally capturing the edges of the stone. And where the stone is sort of pushed further back, we're not getting any sense over here on the right, because we're catching more of this horse on the left and the curve that comes down here, getting a little bit more out of, but there's little bits where it's not fully catching where we want, and we still haven't really got a sense. But if I just move it that little bit further round and there, now suddenly the whole thing comes to life. Everything that we've been trying to see in different lights is now available to us. By getting that shadow, by getting that light source at just the right angle, we're able to highlight one edge of it and shadow, so any depth, there's one side where the light's hitting and there's one side where the shadow is. And that's then is giving us our depth, and we can get a real sense of the depths of the horse's head, of the hooves coming up, we get the manes coming down, we've got the bodies coming down, we've got the kind of the tails around the bit, and these bit, and the Celtic knotwork in the middle. And this then is giving us the clearest amount of texture. So to understand then that the light, the angle of the light source that you have has a huge impact on the amount of texture we are seeing, we are making out. Then taking the same photo, but pretty much the sun went behind the clouds, and here we're back to a kind of ambient light, slightly better than when the sun was behind it, but still not fantastic. We can make out some detail, but nothing like the detail we did with that one. You can see it's the same carving, but this one looks much shallower. This one looks much deeper. This in turn is very often used. We take this idea when I'm doing portraits. For those of you who remember anything where I've been talking about portraiture, there's that notion that where you have the lighting, you can either youthify or age someone's face. If you have large soft boxes, butterfly lighting, a large light source here, a large light source there, maybe even a reflector underneath, so there's a kind of wall of light, it means that there's nowhere for the shadows to hide. So wrinkles sort of drop back in the same way they do there. They don't have the same level of depth. Whereas if you do a single light source from the side, it shows up all the ridges and texture and landscape of the face. And it really adds to the character of a face, but it also tends to age people 5 or 10 years. So everybody else loves the photo because it looks really characterful, but the person who had the photo taken of them hates it because it makes them look older. So understanding then that level of depth makes a difference. And now you can also play with this in Photoshop. What I'll do though is I'll just close that first of all. So I can see there's a couple of extra comments. Kazia saying the pizza makes me hungry. April saying, wow, what a difference. As Stacey is saying, it really does make a difference, the angle and the light on the object. And that's absolutely true. So the next thing then is what you want to do with, if you are wanting to bring out the texture in a photo that you've taken, the thing to really do then is accentuate the contrast. Okay, so what's this? Inga's come in and said, do you think familiarity is absolutely necessary? I often get interested in photos with texture where I have to look twice to catch or understand what I'm looking at. Well, yes, I think part of it comes down to if we're completely unfamiliar with the texture, we are guessing. And there's nothing wrong with that. You can have fun with that idea of guessing. And you can also use it, but you can also use it to fool. You can paint light, and if you think about a painting is just, it's a two-dimensional thing, but you've painted darker on this side and lighter on this side, and so we have a sense of texture and landscape. We can tap into what's familiar for the human experience. And that notion of light and shade, that notion of reflected surfaces, these are things which will make a difference to that sense of texture that all humans who can see have a sense of. The familiarity part of it, I think, is then a case of just how quickly somebody either recognises and knows and understands or connects to, or they have to work at it. Or maybe they can work at it and still never really know. There could be certain flowers which can look hard and spiky, but actually if you run your thumb across them are quite soft. But unless you've ever run your thumb across them, you would never know it was soft just by looking at the photo, because there's a hard spiky quality to the way it reflects the light. So that's what I mean by familiarity. So what I want to do then is I'll just show you what you can do in Photoshop in terms of, so not wanting to mess up with anybody else's face, I'll just take this one. This is self-portrait taken about 3.5 years ago, I think it was. So you can see just how much I've changed and aged in the last 3 years. Most of that being in the last 15 or 16 months, I would think. It's not just the length of the beard. Now, okay, so here we have this young, good-looking Kim Ayres here. And what we're going to do is we're going to open him up in Photoshop. Poor guy had no idea that I was going to mess about with his face like this. So what we've got here then is this is one where I've got a relatively soft light. I can't remember. I think I was using an umbrella. So the flash hit the umbrella, diffused the light, made it a larger light source. So the shadows are softer. They're not completely gone. I wanted some level of shadow. We've got more shadow on the right of the face. It's lighter on the left of the face. We can see shadow behind the nose. In fact, you can just make out the indent there where my glasses normally sit. Slightly shiny a bit on the nose. If you look in the... what happened there? Come back out again. If we look at the eyes and the reflection in the eyes, yeah, I can just see part of that's caught by the brow, but there's a shape there, which reminds me of the umbrella. So I can tell that that's what I was using for my light source. I've also got a light behind lighting up a white sheet. Now, because it's a fairly soft light, because the light, although not straight on, is fairly straightish on, whilst we can make out wrinkles and lines and texture in the face, they're not that prominent. However, if I decide to increase the contrast, we will increase the level of we want to kind of increase the depth of the texture. So I've just duplicated that line for a moment. So let me say we took brightness contrast. Right now, if I take the contrast and I just start to up the contrast, some of these lines start to get deeper. Now, what's also happening, unfortunately, is the way the contrast is, the colours are becoming richer, which is maybe also confusing it. What's also happening is the shadows are getting, some of the shadows are getting more lost, and some of the highlights are getting a bit more lost as well. So what I'll do, let's take this into Camera Raw filter where I can play a little bit more with options. So if I go to the contrast here, I can contrast it like that, and then maybe I can take the saturation down a little bit to counteract the fact that I sort of went very kind of bright orange with it. So just playing with the contrast, I can do that. And we can see that it has a more powerful effect on the sense of the depth of the face and the texture on the face. Now, the brightness contrast is quite a kind of blunt tool as such. Photoshop has more subtle ones. So if I go back into Camera Raw, the two that are much more likely to be used are clarity and texture. And the texture is a more recent one. And this, we've got a little texture slider over here. And if I drag it to the right, you can see it sort of adds more texture. And if I move it to the left, it gets rid of texture. Now, this kind of funny, soft, fuzzy, not texture, you might recognize from people's phone photos. Because what's happened these days is so many phone apps, you do your selfies, and because nearly everybody seems to want to look younger and smooth skinned, these things are often on by default. I was kind of getting a bit worried with my phone for about the first year or so. I couldn't understand why I always looked like I was slightly out of focus, even though no matter how much it said it was lining up on my face. Or when I took the photo, my face seemed softer than it was. And then eventually I found there was a setting in the app which said take off the facial softness, or whatever it was called. So a lot of the apps, they have this built in, and sometimes you see these things and it just looks weird. It just looks like if somebody's sort of fuzzied out. It's not particularly subtle. The other one is clarity. The clarity is sort of somewhere between texture and contrast, and really kind of, and you can see here it boosts that sense of, and then if I do the clarity and the texture, now unfortunately what's happened then is it's making the darks too dark. Now I can offset this by what I do first of all is if I lighten the shadows and I take down the highlights a bit. So I'm kind of pushing everything into the middle. Then I stretch it out with the texture and I stretch it out with the clarity. And now every single pore in my face is standing out much more deeply. Every line, every wrinkle, every little beard hair. Let's just lighten that up a little bit there because it has darkened it as well. And then click OK. And then you can see this difference. So that's it without, and that's it with muchly added texture. So that notion then that it looks much more textured because it has created more contrast between the light and the dark. So even though if we move into the pores on my skin here, we can see that there's pores here. By making the dark bits darker and the light bits lighter, it now makes them look much deeper. So to understand then that texture in terms of the light, just like we were doing with the carving earlier, is the deeper the shadow, the clearer it is, but the thicker you realise the texture is, or you expect it to be. So I'm not going to keep that one on there forever. There we go. Nice, handsome, soft, young skin there that I had 3 years ago. That's all vanished now. Right, okay. So that's what I wanted to talk about. That's really what I wanted to show you with the notion of texture. Sandra says, do you think hard lighting is always the best for bringing out our textures? I think hard lighting does tend to make the texture look, much more so. And Stacey says, it absolutely adds a deeper shade to your face, but most people do not like looking aged. And Abel says, lol, we can look young again. Oh, what's going on now? It's telling me that I've got too low frame rates per second. I set it at exactly what it wanted, so I don't know what's going on with Facebook now. It does. Last week it was telling me that everything was too high. I reset my my software OBS to work specifically with Facebook and do what it wants, and now it's saying now it's complaining again. Anyway, fine. Let's sorry, that's me getting completely distracted by Facebook telling me stuff that you don't need to know. Okay, where are we? Boom, boom, boom. Inga says, I agree, but much interesting portraits have more texture. Ben says, that was really interesting, especially the bit about visual texture evoking other senses. Yeah. There is a thing. I quite often when I'm doing a self-portrait as well, if I'm, one that I'm shoving up on Facebook or on social media, sometimes I do increase the clarity or the texture a bit and essentially age my face a little. Not a lot, but it's subtle. Partly because I think it adds a little bit more character and it's fun. And I'm more interested in the portrait looking interesting than looking young. I'm not too worried about, obviously I'm 54. I don't want to look like I'm 74, but I'm not bothered about looking like I'm 34 either. So I don't mind if people mistake me for being 5 or 10 years older. It's not really worrying me if it makes a more interesting photo. So I will do that. But one of the strange side effects I've found is since I started doing that, quite often people get used to seeing my picture where I look slightly older on social media. And then when they meet me face to face, the first comment is, Kim, you're looking good. I seem to look younger and smoother than they're expecting me to. And it's a bit like, if we go back to this photo here, this photo here, that photo looked fine as it was, and you can see, fine, we've got age, we've got lines, what have you. Then we do this and you go, whoa, that's looking really aged. And then when we come back to this suddenly looks smooth by comparison. And it's something to remember. And it's where actually a lot of people go wrong by using these filters which smooth out their faces, which they then shove up on social media. Because what happens is everybody gets used to seeing them with a smooth face. And that means when they meet them in person, they're comparing to last time they saw them, which was on social media when they had a smooth face. And suddenly all their wrinkles just really leap out. And it's like they've gone from seeing them like this, and then suddenly in real life they look like that, and they go, whoa, what's happened? And obviously most people tend to be polite about it, but you have that problem of the fact that actually you're not doing yourself any favours by smoothing out your face and trying to make yourself look really young, because it just means when people meet up with you, the first thing they're going to notice is the difference, and they're going to think you look much older than you actually are. So I quite often say to people when I'm taking their portrait, let me make you look 10 years older, and then when everybody looks at you, meets you up, they'll be talking about how good you're looking. Needless to say, most people don't take me up on it. Right, okay. Where are we at? Stacey says women are more conscientious of age. Mostly, probably that is a case because our society in general tends to be damn harsh with the way that women aren't allowed to age without being criticised in the same way. Yeah, there's a whole realm of things to go into there, which a different podcast, I think. Becca says very lock, stock, and two smoking barrels. I like it. That's a reference to a particular film. April says people like doctors forget to update their websites, and when you meet them, you get confused. And this is very true. I mean, there's this other problem that quite often people will put up a picture of themselves. The photo that they love of themselves is the photo they took of themselves when they were 20 years younger. And that's the one that they're using as their profile picture. And again, it means when you meet them in real life, they suddenly look 20 years older and you're kind of wondering why they've sent their mother or father along in their place. Okay, Naria says it's a bit like when some women wear makeup constantly and then they don't look, and then when they don't, they look like they're ill. That's true. It's what you get used to. If you're used to seeing somebody without makeup, you'll suddenly really notice when they have makeup on. If you're used to seeing somebody with makeup, you really notice when they don't. So there is a certain amount of image control of how you want people to see you. If I put on one of these and I was suddenly wearing makeup, you'd all find it really weird. However, if I'd been wearing makeup from the very beginning, you might have thought it was a bit odd at the start, but you'd have got used to it very quickly. And, only if I took the makeup off would I then look weird. So I'm not going to try it. Ben says, I like the aged photo trick. Must try it. Right. So that's what I wanted to talk about with texture. So the key elements of really bringing out of getting people to have a sense of texture. One is familiarity, because if you put up something which nobody's familiar with, then they're not necessarily going to know what the texture is like. The second is the notion of the way light is reflecting off it. Is it a shiny surface or a matte surface? And how it's ridged or shaped or formed, which is going to... So that's going to give us a sense of, is it a woolen shirt? Is it silk? Is it metal? So that kind of level. And then there's the depth of it. And the depth of it is indicated by the depth of shadow that appears in the texture. And you can manipulate that depth by where you place the light. So these are the things that you need to keep in mind. So I'll summarize these again at the end when I talk about the texture challenge that I'm going to set you all for next week. Right. Okay. So we'll move on to the critique section. Quick reminder, if you're finding these podcasts useful and interesting and you would like to support them, buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is the way to do it. Another way to help out as well is to invite your friends. Bring people along. Grab anybody you know who you think might be interested and let them know about these podcasts. Share them on your page. You can do that as well. Right. Okay. So, what was it? Yes. Let's go on to critique. Oh, hang on a sec. It's Stacey saying, there are photographs of famous women without makeup and look much different, although younger women have good appearance without the makeup. Faces are smooth. Well, yeah, I mean, we're talking about a thing of the idea, smoothness associated with youth. Therefore, if you have wrinkles, it's associated with age. Age is seen as a big no-no, particularly for women, particularly for people in the public eye and for actors, because the roles actors can get is limited if they're seen to be too old for a part. So yeah, there's a whole kind of cultural thing going on with that. Sometimes, though, people can be photoshopped for adverts and stuff so much that you can fail to recognise them. I remember a few years ago, my wife and I were looking at an advert on the back of a magazine for, I can't remember, Dior perfume or something like that. And there was something vaguely familiar about the woman who was holding the bottle of perfume. But I couldn't think who she was. I absolutely couldn't think it. And I called Maggie and I said, who is this? And we're looking at it for a long while. And then eventually we worked it out. Actually, I can't remember now who it was. But essentially, it was the actress was probably a good 20 to 30 years older than this photoshopped But the Photoshop had been so smooth, it didn't even look like she did 20 years ago. It should be Photoshopped so much that it didn't really look much like her at all. And you think, and yet they've paid her all this money because she's a famous actress, because they want to sell the product. And yet, they then Photoshopped her out of all recognition. So it kind of defeats the point. I don't know. Sometimes it seems to go a bit funny. Straying off the point, a little bit of a tangent. Let's get back to the critique section. So, critique, yes. So this is your chance to get feedback on the images that you are creating. It's extraordinarily difficult to get decent feedback. We shove our photos up on Facebook. Our friends all tell us how wonderful they are because our friends are being nice. And that's lovely, but it doesn't necessarily help us improve our photography. So critique is a place where you can put your images into the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres Facebook group and ask for feedback. Let me know what your sticking point is, let me know where you're having difficulties, and I will do my best to help. Also, what happens periodically is other people in the group chime in and help as well. So there is help about. I mentioned last week the number of challenges is going to be increasing. So essentially during a challenge week, like next week, I'm not really going to be concentrating very much on critique. I might do the odd bit here and there if somebody's asking specifically, but it's not going to be the same level of in-depth. So this means that there won't be as many slots for critique. So do make sure that if you're wanting to improve your photography and you're wanting to get past particular sticking points, you have questions, put them into the Facebook group. Or if you don't do Facebook and you are watching this on YouTube, then you can always message me or email me, or actually leave a comment in the comments on the YouTube video, because most of the time I'm notified and I should pick it up. Okay, right. Now, I am just going to very briefly go to the settings on OBS and go to stream, because, this is apparently going at the recommendations of Facebook, and yet Facebook is telling me it's still too low. I don't know. If I click ignore settings, no, I can't change it now that we're actually underway. Okay, right, fine, I will forget that. Okay, no, wrong button. So, let me see, what are we doing next then? Critique. So, yes, let's make a start on critique. So, let me find pictures, and what we're going to start off with is we're going to start off with Inga, who says, when I go through my photos, I notice the texture, that texture is kind of red, a red theme in many of them. It's often what catches my eye. This is true if we go back to the red challenge, when we were talking about red in photography a few weeks back, that red is one of those colours that just kind of stands out. It's almost like selective colour without having to go selective colour. You don't have to turn everything else black and white, because red will catch your eye before anything else does anyway. So it's quite often, yeah, red is the thing, or reddish things catching. So Inga included several photos, but she said there was wasn't expecting feedback on all of them, but one of the ones she was thinking of particular was a red hammock, and she's wondering how she could have maybe enhanced the texture. Now, whilst red is one of these things that catches your eye very easily, there is also the problem that quite often red can kind of become so dominant it becomes almost difficult to sort of see where one bit ends and another begins. So what we've got here is we've got a red hammock, background, hills, tree, mountains, a bit of grassland fading into the distance. And we've got texture here, and we can sort of see it looks like a sort of slightly silky kind of material. There is a problem with this. Now, if I open this in Photoshop, now whereas with this, all we had to do was play around with a couple of sliders, it doesn't always work so well with red. In fact, as you start kind of increasing it, the red becomes even more overpowering. So let me just show you what I mean by that. If I take the contrast button and I make it deeper, it kind of makes it, it's not helping. It's not really helping separate out. In fact, what happens is we end up losing chunks. The red just becomes overpowerful. you almost, not that kind of contrast. If we increase the texture, helps a little bit. It's not doing a lot. The clarity, again, can help a bit. We lose some of, but again, it's not. It is a difficult one. I think it's really difficult. I remember last year taking a photo of a red peony, and I found it really difficult to edit because it's so red that actually all the reds sort of the light bounces into each other. And what you can distinguish with the eye isn't necessarily so easy to distinguish on a computer screen, which is essentially lower resolution. However, I was playing around earlier, and I think kind of the way I sort of did this was sort of do a two-step process. What I thought I would do is by going to the channels. So what we remember with black and white, certainly in Photoshop, there's a notion of channels where it splits the colour into red, green, and blue channels. And what we find is on the red channel, there's actually we're making out quite a bit of the texture. When we go to the green channel, everything's kind of becoming very blackish and there's not as much texture. And when we go to the blue, again, it's sort of struggling. And I would say if we look at the three of them, then actually where we've got the most texture for this hammock is actually in the red channel, surprisingly. So if I copy that, come back to here and then paste it on top. Now I've got that, I can change I can go up to the layers bit here where it says normal, and I can change the interaction between this layer and the layer below. So there's multiply, color burn, darker color, lighten, screen. There's all sorts of options here which do weird things with the way that it interferes with or interacts with the layer below. So, but what I found here is if I go to overlay seems to bring out a little bit more of the contrast, but without drowning it in the same way. So if we look at, say, this section here, do you see that it actually brings out more detail? However, having done that, what's also happened is we've lost some of the background, and everything's become slightly paler. So what we might need to do is actually increase the saturation of colour. Because we put a black and white layer over it, although it's not completely black and white, it has removed some of the saturation. So if I go to hue saturation and just up that a little bit here, bring that back into the reds, it's also looking slightly more pinkish, so I might need to just nudge that to the right a little bit to make that back into the red again. So now if I let's just group those together, and you can see the difference between that and that. Now, if I decided that I didn't want so much going on with the background there, if I wanted to keep the original background, then I could mask that out. I could essentially, I'll create a mask up here, change that to black, and paint in the original back in there. So we could do something like that if we wanted. And basically, though, is what we find is here now we've gone from that, which was the original, and that, which gives us a little bit more texture than we had. But without a doubt, playing around with red is the trickiest one, and sometimes you've got to muck around with different stage processes, or you might find that it's working more in one area than another, in which case you might want to mask it off again. So I don't know whether that helps, Inga. I hope it does. But thank you for sending that in. Right, okay, let's close that. And next up then, actually what I will do, I'll show you, although I'm not going to go in and edit them, I will just show you a couple of other photos that Inga put in. So she put in this one, which it's got a lot of texture on it, but I can see that what's happened here, this has got very much a kind of post-processing texture to it. Because of these kind of flowers are quite often a lot smoother than that, I think what happened is I don't know whether you're using Photoshop, but it has the feeling that your clarity, you've taken the slider and really kind of whacked it up to full. And whilst it does bring out the texture, that I would say there's a little feeling of it being overcooked. That there comes a point whereby it's a tricky thing because certain techniques, we do editing to enhance the photo, we enhance the narrative of the photo. Sometimes what we're doing is we are trying to enhance or correct even the limitations of the camera. And so we nudge things and we nudge things and we nudge things, but we get used to the last level we nudged it at, and then we can nudge it a bit further and then a bit further. And before we know it, we've kind of gone wildly away from the beginning. And I think this is one of those cases where when I look at it, I no longer see the flower and I no longer see the texture. All I see is the editing process. So you kind of got to be careful that sometimes the editing can be over-edited. Unless that's particularly the effect that you were going for, in which case that's fine. But for my taste, and certainly if I'm thinking that, there will be others who think that. Of course, it's up to you whether you decide that matters or not. But my feeling tends to be that if you just dialed that back a bit, you would still have a sense of texture, but you wouldn't lose quite as many people who were then too busy looking at the editing process rather than the actual picture itself. But I mean, really interesting texture in that. What else? I quite like this one from Inga as well. Not totally sure on the crop or the composition. However, what you do have here is multiple textures, and there is that texture of lying on the paving stone here, which has got one texture. You've got moss down here, which is another texture, and then of course you've got fluffy cat, and you can absolutely feel the texture of the fur. If you ever run your hand over a cat's fur, you just know what that feels like. Although you might also be slightly wary that you're going to get claws into your arm as well. And then Inga also put in this one, where we've got rust and all sorts of textures sitting on an old piece of metal, which is really interesting as well. However, this looks like it's sort of ready to edit in a way, or maybe it's already been edited, but I don't necessarily feel like the angle is, you could be straight onto it, or you could be closer up, kind of running along the length of the bar of it. This kind of looks more like you're standing there looking down at it, and I think there are more interesting angles to play with. Anyway, I did want to show you those while I was here. So, thank you for sending those, Inga. Okay, Inga says, thanks a lot, really interesting. Edited in Lightroom, but actually not much of clarity in texture. Okay. No, April says, I feel the softness of the cat, and Sandra also thinks that the cat texture is excellent. Cool. Oh, something I wanted to say. I was completely forgotten. Jim, are you still watching? For those of you who were watching last week, and when I was talking about photographing live bands, one of the pictures I put up, I talked about when photographing live bands was a lot of fun could be had by turning your camera back onto the audience. And there was a point whereby and this was at a status quo concert, I turned back and looking up into the rows, there were three guys with inflatable guitars, all sort of pretending they were sort of status quo thing, and I thought it was quite funny. And a couple of them clocked me looking at them, and this photo I put up, and I love this photo. I thought it was a lot of fun. Jim Harkness from Dumfries turns around and says, "That's me." So who knew that? Actually, here we go. Here's Jim. So if you wanted to know what some of our other viewers are like, this is Jim. So I hadn't clocked it at all, Jim. So thank you for telling me that. If I'd known this last week, I would have pointed it out last week. But I thought it can't go by without comment. So lots of fun there. So who knows? Who realised I'd actually been taking photos of some of these viewers, some of the viewers of this podcast, without even realising. So anyway, thanks for letting me know that, Jim. I did think that was a bit of fun. Right. Okay. All right. Inga says thank you for the useful feedback. That's good. Right, next thing then is, Jim says thanks for the shout out. Right, okay, so Sandra then. Now, Sandra took a photo and said, this was the photo she took, and she said, I was rather pleased with the starburst coming through the lobster pots, but the sky is too light. Is there a way I could have got a darker sky when I was taking the photo? Or what could I have done in Photoshop to darken the sky? Feedback welcome. Now, interestingly, a couple of bits of feedback came from other viewers of the podcast and other people that are members of the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres Facebook group. John Painter said you could look up a graduated neutral density filter. It's a filter with a darkened area on one side and an unfiltered area on the other, graduating between the two. You can use it to dim down light areas and brighten dark areas in the same image. And really, what you're talking about is you've got a filter which you put across the front of the lens, and it's darker and grades down. And people use this a lot, quite often, when you're wanting to get, because if you are adjusting your exposure for the foreground, but you've got a bright sky, the sky just brightens out, overexposes. If you adjust for the sky, the foreground gets too dark. And this is a problem for all photographers. And so a graded filter can often help with that. The other thing is shooting in camera raw gives you more flexibility than if it's just a JPEG. Now, I did ask, I left it too late. I meant to ask Sandra if she could send me the raw file of this if she had it, because I would have been interested to see how much more detail I could have drawn out. As it is, I've just got a Facebook copy of the JPEG, so there will be limitations to what I can do this evening. Then Russ came in as well just this afternoon, say another option, if your camera has the option, ideally use a tripod, is where you use bracketing. And that's where you take 3 photos at different exposures and blend them together in post-processing. And yes, there are cameras that, quite a lot of cameras will do this somewhere in the settings. You might either find, if you've got a manual, or go online, you'll probably find it much quicker, to type in your camera and say bracketing photos how to. Google that or YouTube that, and you are almost bound to find somebody out there who can tell you how to do it. And really what you do then is you put your camera, and you want it on a tripod because all 3 images have to be lining up in exactly the same thing, or it certainly helps if they do. So you take one photo where it's a kind of general photo where it's exposed for the mid-ranges. You then take one photo where you're exposing for the sky, and you take another photo where you're exposing for the darker areas. So you're essentially ending up with 3 different photos. Then, in your software, Photoshop does it, and I'm sure there's plenty of it, most editing softwares will do this, the more sophisticated ones, where you can then go to an automate setting to blend the images together. And the computer program will work out that where the light bits can be darker, the dark bits can be lighter, and the mid-ranges can kind of hold it together. So that's another way of doing it. In terms of if you're playing in Photoshop, then in essence what we do is, no, not that, I don't mean to do that, duplicate layer, that's what I meant to do. We go to open this in Camera Raw. Then if you have taken a raw photo in RAW, whilst this sky might look quite light, there could well be more detail within it. And similarly, some of the stuff that seems to be lost in the shadows, there could be more detail here. So what we can do, if we take the shadow and we pull the slider to the right, we can see here, let's just zoom in a bit more, say we take that bit of rope, we can pull that out, and we can pull quite a lot of detail out of the shadows. There's much more detail there than we thought there was originally. The sky, by contrast, what we do is we take the highlights and we slide that to the left, so we're darkening the highlights. Now we can see that there is some colour in the sky, but we've got a lot of banding. You know, we've got these lines going here. Now part of that is because this is a low resolution photo, because it's come through, it's a web size photo that's come through Facebook. If you had the raw if you've still got the original raw file, try doing this. Take the highlights and move it to the left and see how much more detail comes out. Take the shadows and pull it to the right and see how much more detail comes out. And then once you've got that, again, if you want, you can play with texture and clarity. If I take the clarity, I can just add a bit more detail, a bit more contrast into that. Maybe this is looking now a bit too overcooked. I can drop some of that down a little bit. Again, forgetting the banding for the moment, hopefully it wouldn't be quite so bad in the original photo. But then you've got something that you can play with there. And I think, oops, that is definitely overcooked, but it does give you a sense of, so what I can do is actually change the amount of that I want. Maybe if I just sort of nudge it up to there, it still looks kind of natural without looking over edited. And that's at about 58% from what I was doing. The sky here, as the photo you've got, you might want to replace the sky, either using the sky replace, that tool that I was showing you on Robert's photo, was it? A couple of weeks ago? Or you can create, for that matter, you can do something whereby let's do a select color range. Or actually, I'll tell you what, we'll just do a very quick kind of select this area, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new layer, and if we take something where we get sort of a bit of blue, this is only very rough, but it will give you a sense of what's going on, and then a gradient map, and we do something like, oh no, not that. We'll change it to that and do it the other way around, and that's a terrible color blue, so I wouldn't actually use that blue. Let's change that blue. Let's get it slightly. I'm going to have problems with this, I can tell. Doesn't really matter. It's only to give you a sense of what's going on here. That really is terrible. Okay, forgetting the colour, I can just sort of drag that back a bit. Point being is that if you want, you can stick your own sky in, and to get rid of the banding. Anyway, essentially that's what you can do. You can replace the sky, but if you've shot it in RAW in the first place, you should be able to get more details back out of the sky. Or, as Russ mentioned, you can bracket it by taking 3 photos of exactly the same scene, but with different exposures. But if you are going to do that, and you want the software to be able to help you, it works best if the photos are lined up exactly. So have it on a tripod, take your first photo, change the exposure, take your second, change the exposure, take your third. With those 3 photos, you can then put them into your software and blend them together how you would like. So, hope that helps, Sandra. Right, okay. Close that. And what else have we got here? So Brian says the man with the yellow guitar is, Bob Brown, also a member of the Abbey Camera Club, along with Jim. Aha! So they're out with your blow up guitars instead of your cameras. What else have we got here? I'm never entirely sure that I'm getting all the messages that turn up. April says, that's great with the shadows and the highlight. Looking through the netting is cool. Robert says, in the sky. Not sure quite what you're replying to. Jackie says, banding can play havoc with editing. And absolutely it can. Banding is one of these, the more you... Remember, you might remember I said recently, one of the problems is essentially with noise, is the more you edit, the noisier things get. Similarly, when you're creating gradations, the more you edit, the more you run that problem of banding. And now somebody said, I thought I saw something about banding there. Seems to have vanished. I could have sworn somebody said, oh no, there we go. Robert said you can change the image to 16 or 32-bit to remove the banding. That is another way of playing with the editing, and it's a good, yes, thank you for reminding me of that, Robert. And now it's not really going to necessarily work on this, but just to show you, there is a point up here where if you go to image mode, that's right, you'll see it's defaults to 8-bit. Sorry, my mistake. So yeah, Robert's saying about the idea of changing your bit mode. Now what happens, so if we go to image mode, and then we've got it defaults to 8 bits per channel. You can go to 16 bits per channel or even 32 bits per channel. And this is 8 bits essentially doubling the amount of information, 30 bits quadrupling the amount of information. And what it means, though, is it does mean, if I put that at image, let's go to 32. And let's just see what happens. Filter. Oh yeah, the problem is you can't use camera raw filter at that level either. So you are kind of offsetting certain things. But what it does do is you can kind of edit things. So if let's say I was just playing with if I want to bring down the curves in the sky, we're getting a bit of banding here, but we're not getting anything like the same amount of banding that we were earlier. If I zoom in here, I don't know how well you can see that. You can see that we've got some banding, but it's not as bad as it was when we were at 8 bits. What it does do, though, is you've got to bear in mind that it multiplies up the size of your file massively as well. And also, if your computer's at its edge, then each editing stage will your computer will be chugging to get it done. So yes, there are ways you can kind of play around with that as well. But certainly, first of all, taking camera raw, and also sometimes it's easier to bring out the details from the shadows than it is to bring them out from the highlights. When the highlights are blown, they really do tend to be blown and gone. So I think somebody suggested, Russ might have suggested, or John, I can't remember now, I don't think it was John, I think, said expose for the sky and then bring the detail out of the shadow. So if you only do get the chance to do one, try and kind of expose for the slightly brighter areas so they're not blown out. And then you've probably got more chance of bringing more detail out of the shadows rather than the other way round. So yeah, thanks for that, guys. Okay, where are we? Oh, Jim says, interesting edits on the lobster basket. Sandra says, a photo was taken as a JPEG, but they usually do respond well to Photoshop elements raw. I will be giving the suggested alteration. I will be trying out the suggested alterations. I will also have a look at a bracketing video and have practice. That's good. Right, oh, and Robert said the banding you see now is due to Photoshop. It should be free of banding after export. Okay, well, that's something else to try out as well then. But yeah, certainly kind of going into higher bit rates gives you more to play with, I think. Now, what was I going to say? There was... Yeah, oh, yes, that's what I... Right, Sandra, so you say that the photo was taken in JPEG. The JPEG is an easy way of doing it. Certainly, it does mean that you can fit more onto your memory card when you're out. But I really would suggest learning camera raw, because it's a lot of the times the JPEG will do what you need it to. But it depends. Well, what I say, it depends how much you want to get into the editing. If you are really getting into editing, the simple fact is your raw file keeps much more of the original data. It's why it's 10 times bigger than a JPEG. A JPEG is a compressed version of the file. So essentially the algorithms in the camera have already made the edit for you. They've already decided these light bits can just merge together, these dark bits can just merge together, because it's looking to save space. So it deliberately loses some of the information. You don't keep the same amount of information, whereas the raw file, you keep all of the information. So that means when you come to editing it, initially the raw file doesn't look as interesting as a JPEG. It tends to look flatter and uninteresting. But it's not supposed to be just raw file print. Raw file is there to edit. This is the place where you can start drawing details out of the shadows and back out of the highlights. And you can make more colour adjustments. And you've got more to play with. It's definitely a way to go. If you are ever wanting to sort of improve your editing levels, go to raw. It will be frustrating to begin with, but ultimately it will give you an awful lot more. You will yourself in a year's time will really thank your present self for having started the journey. Right, okay, so on to the last couple of images here come from VG. I will deal with both of them because they are about cropping which is relatively straightforward. Haha, he says. So what VG said? VG said 2 photographs taken before COVID, and this means before the podcast sessions. So the photographs are less than perfect, but I would love to hear about the cropping. Both the photos were taken by a zoom lens. It'd be great to hear how they could be cropped. Just to show you that this was, this one here, no, not that one. This is VG's cropped in version of this is the one she put up on Facebook, and then she sent me the original and wanting to know really, is there a better way of cropping it? Now, first of all, what an amazing place. Wow, I would love to, I love this castle thing with the bits looking like they're going underground and sort of really built into the rock. A lot of fun there. How to crop it? I mean, there's a bit here where it was I quite like the fact that you've got all these hills and mountains in the distance, just which are actually just being cropped off here. In a way, I would have liked you to have been back a little bit further and being able to see the top of the hill and maybe see some of those mountains in the distance as well to give it a context. That's one way of going. So let's just open that in Photoshop for a moment. Now, again, it's not going to work directly. It doesn't really matter, though. I just to give you a sense of, in terms of, really, I would have wanted something more that kind of size, I think. So we could have had, and then this part here sits down in that kind of bottom corner of rule of thirds. Now, if I do content aware, it's not really going to do it proper justice, I don't think. But it's really done some strange things up here with that. I didn't mean to do that. Let's just grab the patch tool and turn that over to sky. There. Not really working. Okay, forget that bit. The point being is that I quite like then that you would have more mountains and scenery in the background, that we would have the top of that hill regardless of that blurb up there, and then that gives a real sort of sense of that sort of fortress on the rock. Now the other alternative is to crop in closer, which is what you did. Now if we go back to the original here, I think what you did was pretty much something like that. And the problem here is, I think, in fact, actually, let's just open up your one, because you did in fact open it. You did it come in a bit closer. Now that's okay, but I think what we've got here is we've got a problem with too much room on the right. If we look back at the original photo, it really feels like the photo sweeps from the right towards the left. Although the doors of the gateways are sort of facing off to the right, the cliff face itself is facing to the left. And as such, in here, it feels like what we should have essentially shifted it in the other direction. So that rather than having all the space to the right, you kind of want to have more space to the left, I think. And if you were to do something a little bit more like this, if you were deciding that cropping in was important, then I think this gives a slightly better feel to it, that you've then become very aware of that cliff edge here. Over on the right of that picture, once you got beyond the walls, there wasn't a lot that was really interesting to it, whereas here's where the action's happening, and we can now follow the steps up here, through here, up here, and then follow the path along off to the left. And I think that's really where the eye is following. So something as simple as cropping to having more to the left of the picture than the right, rather than the way you did it there, I think kind of helped shape that up a bit. So hope that one helps. Now, the other one you talked of, VG, was this photo, which you cropped into that. And to go back to your picture, the mum and daughter pic, not sure what made me zoom close, but the moment was captured. So you mailed me the original. So now, given, let's close that. Given that what you've got here I think, you know, that crop is probably the right place to be. But what, in essence, the problem really here is, I think, having cut off the chin of the mother, it feels very unbalanced. And again, it would have been nice if you'd been further out, I think. If we come here, move slightly to the right, but just back a bit. You can always crop in a little bit more, but you can't crop out so easily without using things like the content aware, which it just isn't going to work on a face. The content aware wouldn't know what to do with that chin. So it's a beautiful moment with mother and daughter face to face. The mother just with eyes closed is lovely, and the nose is just starting to squash together. But like I say, you really needed to have it further out and to the right, and more of that picture, and down a bit, so I think you would get her chin and neck into it. So that's really one of centering. Is there anything you can do with it as is? Because the crop that you did, I think the problem is we still have this problem of the mother's face not being fully there. So my suggestion then would be, what you could do is kind of zoom in even closer. Now, one of the things I'm aware of this one is in your that it's a very high ISO. It's 3200, which means when we zoom in, it is really quite a noisy photo. There's a lot of noise there, and because of that, what I really want to do with this, I think, is I think you could zoom in and capture the faces closer. Because the chin isn't there, you want to kind of get right up into the eyes. Let me zoom in a bit more here. See, I think it's more in and around here that it becomes interesting. So what we're talking about is this kind of thing. Just get above the lips. Maybe we'll keep the girl's ear in. Maybe if we just rotate it a little bit, something like that, perhaps, or do we go maybe that way a little bit, and keep all of her chin in. So we're kind of looking at something like this, I think. So that becomes, so what we're doing now is, because the photo in its original state just kind of missed and didn't, we're seeing if we can do something else with it. And the something else here is to sort of play with it. It's got to be a little bit more stylistic with it. We can come in really close here. Now, I think, like I said, we've got a slight problem with the fact that, you know, if you were trying to print it up at all, there's a lot of noise in here. So if we then take that into Camera Raw, one of the things they have is we can kind of denoise a bit, where if I go to the detail, I can go noise reduction. And more specifically, one of the other things is, if we zoom in, the noise has things kind of color banding in it as well. So if you take I'm just under noise reduction, it says color noise reduction. You move that layer to the right, and you can see that some of that color banding that's in there helps to go down. So you can do that. If we want to sharpen up the eyes a bit, you know, the problem is we then kind of make it noisy again. So another option, and then it wouldn't really worry about color noise reduction, is what we do is we drop it into black and white. Now, at the moment, it's kind of we want more contrast. So then what we do is we start playing around with the contrast. Maybe we brighten it up a little bit, and then we play with the contrast a little bit more, something like that. And if we wanted, we could just add a little bit of vignette, just to kind of pull the attention a little bit more into the center here. You could play with the clarity touch, just to kind of accentuate that a little bit, something like that. And now, although there is the noise, because it's black and white, somehow you can kind of get away with it. Remember last week when I was talking about the band photos, that like doing live bands, that actually quite often in poor light conditions, you know, you have to use high ISO, and then actually if you put it in black and white, you can get away with more. There's a kind of more of an expectation with black and white that you can have a bit of noise in there. So I think what we'd like to say, what we're doing here is stylizing somewhat, and then at that point, if we want, we can maybe just take the dodge tool and lighten up the white of the eye there a little bit, like that, so that that's not being lost. We don't need to do it with Mother's eye because she's got her eye closed. And there we end up with, it's a very different kind of photo to your original. But I think given the fact that you sort of chopped part of the mum's face off and we can't recover that, we're then going through and making the changes to create a different kind of photo. So I hope that gives you some ideas, VG, something to think about and play with. Right, okay, let's minimize that, and a few more comments. What have we got here? Oh, quite a few more comments. All right, there's bits about banding, shooting in camera raw. Russ agrees that it works better with the space to the left. That would be your Fortress one. Jim takes both RAW and JPEG, uses the JPEG for quick reference and social sharing, and uses the RAW for fine editing before saving. And that's pretty much, I would say, I do that. I have my camera set to take RAW and JPEG precisely for that. So the JPEG is great for quick reference, or even doing very quick thumbnail edits. They're just to give me a guidance. But if I'm then going to sit down and properly edit a photo, then I use the RAW one. Okay, VG says, yes, the path makes all the difference. Sandra likes the picture of the mother and daughter. Jackie says, I normally leave loads of space for cropping in all the images. Yeah, Stacey says, I can hear the words, give it space to breathe. Jackie says, haha, so can I. Right. What else have we got? VG says, I do too, but I was a newbie back then and never thought about it. A year back only before I started to learn the nuances. Before that, I was always in point and shoot. Yeah, we have to admit, VG has come a long way in this past year. It's quite amazing what the kind of photos you're creating now by comparison. Jim says the cropped in makes a lovely photo. Pat loves the mum and daughter photo. VG says she also likes the crop. And yeah, a couple more people are enjoying the tight crop and the black and white version. Did somebody say much better? And yes, yeah, and the noise also looks good in this, I think VG says. Nuria loves the little curly bit of the hair, and the black and white version. Russ says it's a lovely intimate shot that's captured a moment. A couple more people like the black and white version. Robert says you can rotate the photo as well. This is true. I did try playing around with that rotation, to be honest, but in the end came back to the original when I was sort of practicing and playing with it. But yes, rotating and mucking around, yes, always worth playing. This is true. Right, okay, so that's it in terms of the critique section. And so next week then, texture. The texture challenge. I hope as many of you as possible will take part. As always now, as I talk about the idea of one photo each, please don't put in 2 or 3 and say I couldn't decide, you pick one, because I'll only end up writing underneath, which is your favourite. This is about texture. This is about touch. Right? Fine, you may use food or you may use flowers where you're evoking a sense of smell or taste or anything else, but primarily the point of the texture challenge is you are trying to evoke the sensation of touch and feel in the viewer. Okay? What we're going to do, I want you to find interesting textures. I want you to find ways of expressing and capturing those interesting textures. I want you to create a photo where the viewer could imagine what it would be like running their fingers over it, rubbing their thumb across, placing against the side of their face, or rubbing their body up against it, or leaning against it, or just coming in close. That notion of texture, of touch. Touch is everything here. And now what you need to think about then is, how are you going to emphasize that sense of touch? And the emphasis will come partly through the three things that I talked about earlier. First of all, familiarity. Now that may or may not be. Perhaps you've got something which is unique to your culture or to your geography or just your way of life, or something you've got around the house where you want to show off something, and actually people will go, I've got no idea what that texture would be because I'm unfamiliar with that plant or food or cloth or material or animal or whatever. But if people are completely unfamiliar with it, they're not necessarily going to be, it's not necessarily going to evoke that sense of touch within them. So it's one to think about, but be aware of. You might lose some of your audience with that. Another thing then is the thinking about the quality of the material, the reflectiveness of the surface. If you think about when things are damp, or when they're silky, or when they're dry, when they're brittle, how are you going to reflect that? And then we're moving then also onto the notion of light. How are you going to light these images in such a way that they enhance that narrative, they enhance that texture, they get across to the viewer that bit more of what it would be like if they were able to reach through the photo, reach through the screen or the print, and actually touch the thing itself. This is what we're trying to evoke. And I think it's such, the whole notion with photography of trying to evoke something more than they can actually just naturally see. The more a viewer is putting of themselves into it, the more they're recalling, remembering, imagining, evoking, then the more powerful the image tends to be. So this is your challenge. This is what you're going to do. Put your images then into the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres Facebook page. If you've not already joined it, please do. If you don't do Facebook, you can email me. You can find my email address on my website easily enough. Say what it's about. Let me know. Yes, the backstory. I want to know what it is you're showing me. Don't just put up something with no explanation. Tell us about it. Why have you chosen this texture? What's interesting about it? You know, is this plant one that you have that grows abundantly? Is it a case of this is the skin of a particular creature that's kept in a tank somewhere because it's horrifically poisonous? Whatever else it is, you know, there's some story about it. If you've chosen a texture to photo, there's a reason you chose that. Let us know about it. Then next week, when I go through the photos, I can read out the stories as well. And what we're hoping to do is inspire each other. Okay? We're going to have a go. We'll put in our textured photos, and hopefully everybody watching will get a chance to see other people's photos and go, oh, that looks interesting. I've got to give that a go myself. Or that reminds me of something else, or that inspires me to go and try something else out. And that's really what the challenge is about. That partly about you getting out of your comfort zone and really trying to create something, and also about inspiring and being inspired by everybody else. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what you're going to come up with. Tomorrow I will be putting this recorded version of this up on YouTube and then onto my blog. On my blog, I will also write, I'll probably repeat a little bit of what I've been talking about today, about things to think of when it comes to texture. And then I will set up an event page on Facebook, again, outlining the notions of texture, what they are, and And again, if you happen to know any other photographers who you think might enjoy getting involved in this, point them to this podcast, point them to the first part of it, point them to the one on YouTube, find the link, or to my blog. Say, look, watch the first 20 minutes where he talks about texture and the stuff about it, get a sense of it, and then enter the challenge as well. Spread the word. Right, that's it. If you've enjoyed this session and you feel like you would like to support it, buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one way of doing so. Last couple of comments here. We've got Stacey says, I'm getting ready to work my second job. Thank you, Kim. As always, a pleasure. Your mannequin changed position yet again. My mannequin changes position every single week. How many people have noticed? Ben says he's looking forward to the challenge. And then we've got a few more people saying good night and they've enjoyed the session. That's great. Okay, excellent. Thank you ever so much to everybody for turning up. Thank you to all those who submitted something. And I look forward to seeing what you all submit next week. Good night. Take care.